Continuing our discussion of the non-consumption agreements and non-importation acts. Interestingly enough, the non-consumption agreements was one avenue that provided colonial women with the opportunity to participate in politics, to use our term, the public sphere, even though, as we know, they're traditionally barred from this particular arena, right? Well, during these times, it was the women who were often in charge with purchasing those particular household goods, right? They're the ones who, went to the markets by the docks and they purchased English goods there. But now, what did they do here with the passage of the non-agreement acts? Well, what they did is proactively boycott these goods. So interesting to see how women, again, were able to participate and even exercise some political agency, as stated here. So here's an engraving showing not necessarily participation in the non-importation agreements because, she's holding a musket, but it does show the revolutionary spirit, if you will, of even colonial women. Now you look at this poster here, and what it's doing is calling out someone named William Jackson, who is an importer of English goods. And what interests us here is the statement below it here. First of all, he identifies the person and identifies the location, right, in Boston. And it states here, it is desired that the sons and daughters of liberty would not buy one thing of him of course is William Jackson, for in so doing they will bring disgrace upon themselves and their posterity forever and ever. Amen. So here again it reflects this idea, okay? Don't break the non-consumption agreements. And for those who did, well, they're subject to public shaming. You see their names printed in the local newspaper. You see their names posted in bulletins like this throughout town, like William Jackson. And you see them even tarred and feathered, as we discussed that public shaming a while back. So all this idea of boycotting and non-importation, it's, when you think about it, it's quite modern, this idea of boycotting. Why? Because it's involved with consumerism. It's interesting to note here the connection between, consumption and consumerism of particular goods, how that can reflect a larger political philosophy. These two are connected here. One is very abstract, right, political philosophy, and the other one is very concrete, right? That is to say, the purchase of goods and consumerism. So this actually harkens back to the Stamp Act argument, how it began with concrete and material arguments and then delved eventually into political philosophy. Now, one important event that happened in 1770 was the Boston Massacre. And during this time, you see the presence of English troops still hanging around, even though the 70 Years' War had ended a while back. In fact, you see the increasing presence of English troops because of the tension surrounding the Townshend duties. And it became a regular sight, that is to say, the presence of English troops patrolling around, colonial towns. And if you're a colonial, you really resented this spectacle. You interpret it as a standing army in your presence. But nonetheless, you see these troops constantly around, and sometimes they were subject to harassment from the townspeople. So in this particular episode, you see in Boston, again, the troops marching around the town. And they became subject to harassment from the colonials. And it rapidly escalated when the colonials started throwing things at the troops like clamshells and rocks and snowballs. and what have you. And the confusion abounded because of this. And one of the English troops, one soldier, actually ended up firing. And this led other English troops firing their muskets as well. And it led to the death of 5 Bostonians. And by the way, the first person to be killed during this whole period of colonial crisis stretching back to 1763, and therefore he's considered the first martyr, if you will, of the American Revolution. His name was Crispus Attucks, and he was actually an African American. So interesting to note that, how an African American person was the first person to die in the struggle for freedom. But nonetheless, you see this happening, and it's put forth as a massacre, the Boston Massacre of 1770. And the English troops involved are brought to trial in Boston, not in England, in Boston. And by the way, who ends up legally representing the English troops in court? Well, that was a lawyer named John Adams. And John Adams, as you probably know, is an important founding father who eventually became our second president. So John Adams actually serves as the defense attorney for these English troops who killed colonials. And by the way, what does that indicate to you at this juncture in 1770? Well, it should be obvious that at this point, someone like John Adams, let alone other people, like many of our founding fathers, who would become the vanguard of leadership by 1776, well, they were not exactly revolutionary yet. That is to say, there's no radical ideas about claiming independence with the mother country at this point. They did not want separation yet. In fact, here's our important founding father, right, John Adams, defending the English colonials successfully in court. All right, so again, this is another example of why you could argue the American Revolution was not exactly inevitable, as some people are apt to believe. Now, eventually, you do see the English Parliament repealing the Townshend duties. And again, this is a major victory had by the colonials. Let's remember, even the Grenville Acts were repealed. This is the second major victory. And again, you see a return to more peaceful times, relatively speaking, a rise in prosperity. But that would last only briefly with the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. And again, this would spark feelings of colonial revolt. Now, just to foreshadow things to come here, the colonial response is actually going to pick up a notch. It will be more defiant, in other words, compared to the earlier responses to the Stamp Act and to the Townshend duties. And what that's going to do, it's going to cause Parliament to get fed up, basically, with the colonials and to put their foot down, so to say, to draw that hard line and to exact some punitive measures against the colonies. Specifically Boston at first, and then it'll spread from there. But before we discuss that and its particularities, let's discuss why the Tea Act was passed in the first place. It was passed because an important economic institution was faltering at that time, and that's the East India Company, as stated here. Okay, the British East India Company. And just as it sounds, it was a chartered company, a joint stock company. But it was involved in Asia. It started in India, and then it branched out towards even East Asia. But by this time, the East India Company was running into economic trouble. And the government knew that they had to rescue the company before it met disaster. So they came up with several schemes, and one such idea was called the Tea Act. And what this did, if you look at the slide here, it lowered tax on British tea. Now, what's the logic here? Okay, they're lowering duties, lowering taxes on English tea. Well, hopefully you could see the relation here in terms of the gaining of revenue. The strategy was this. By lowering the tax on English tea, it would hopefully entice the colonials to purchase English tea over other types of tea, such as French tea or Dutch tea, because it made English tea cheaper. So that was the economic logic. And with that revenue gained from the tax, they could apply towards the faltering British East India Company. And notice, furthermore, that this is an external tax, right? Not an internal tax, but external. All right, so that's the logic behind it. But what about the colonial response? Well, first of all, and I mentioned this a while back, that when we hear about lowering taxes, we are not angry, but happy about that. But in this case, the colonials, despite the fact that you see lowering taxes, you see them infuriated. This is the opposite response that was expected. And again, it leads to the question, why this type of colonial response? Well, here is the basic colonial mindset about the Tea Act. And it's that the colonials truly believed that they were being selectively chosen via the Tea Act to rescue the East India Company. That the colonials are being burdened for this financial state of insolvency, right, that the British East India Company was facing. And it's a disguised way of doing this, right? It's disguised as a lower tax, felt the colonials. But in fact, it's meant to manipulate the colonials to buy their tea. All right? And through this manipulation, the colonials end up saving the East India Company. And also another stance held by the colonials was that if the colonials started indeed purchasing English tea due to the lower taxes, what they're doing ultimately is selling out. They're selling out on their principles. The principles that go back all the way to 1763. Now, that's already a decade ago with the Tea Act, right? Going back to the Sugar Act, the Grenville Acts. And through the decade, the colonials always held their stance, right? They never sold out, so they felt they can't sell out now after all they've been through. It would be a violation of their freedom and so on. Well, look at the situation. Even though they're lowering duties, the colonials felt like they were being tricked or manipulated into buying English tea just because it's less expensive. But in doing so, you're abandoning that patriotic position, right? And that position is to resist all attempts, particularly economic attempts, to control the consumption habits of the colonials. And this is why consumerism, which I introduced a while back in this course, is so central, right? It's a central part of the American Revolution. So eventually this led to an episode known as the Tea Party, and it's pictured here in this illustration. Now, a little bit of backdrop here. The governor, I should say the royal governor, meaning that he's appointed by the English Parliament. The royal governor, his name was Hutchinson. Well, Hutchinson was expecting one particular ship whose cargo was indeed British tea, because he was going to make some money off the profit of, that tea. And therefore, it was in his vested interest to make sure that that particular ship, it was called the Dartmouth, actually docks in Boston Harbor and unloads its cargo. But he also knew that there's a lot of patriots in Boston, namely the Sons of Liberty. So in defiance of those patriots, he orders the Dartmouth to dock. And that's going to lead to the famous Tea Party.